Subscribe and keep this channel alive. In Westminster Abbey right now, there's a small marble urn. Inside that urn are the bones of two children. Scientists have been asking permission to test those bones since the 1980s. The royal family keeps saying no. That's the story. Now let's go back to where it starts. June 13th, 1483, the Tower of London. A 12-year-old boy is inside. He has been there for nearly 2 months. He arrived as the King of England. He arrived with servants, with guards, with the expectation of a coronation. Somewhere between arriving and the day this story gets dark, all of that disappeared. His name was Edward. He was the 5th English king by that name. He was never crowned, and within weeks of this moment, nobody outside the tower would ever see him again. He had a brother with him. Richard of Shrewsbury was 9 years old. 2 boys, one of the most fortified buildings in England, and then silence. That silence has lasted 441 years, and the people who could end it have chosen not to. Here's what the historical record actually tells us. Not what Shakespeare said, not what the later accounts built up, but what was documented at the time. Edward V's father, King Edward IV, died on April 9, 1483. Edward was 12 years old and living at Ludlow Castle, not yet in London. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector, the man responsible for running the kingdom until the young king could be crowned. What happened next moved fast. Richard intercepted Edward's traveling party on April 30th. By May 19th, Edward was inside the Tower of London. That was not unusual in itself. The Tower was a royal residence, not just a prison. Kings stayed there before their coronations. Then, Edward's younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, was brought in to join him on June 16th. And then, sometime in the summer of 1483, documentation of the 2 boys simply stops. What most people never learn is this. A man named Dominic Mancini, an Italian visitor to London, almost certainly sent to observe and report back to the French court, wrote an account before leaving England at the end of 1483. He noted that the princes had ceased to appear altogether. He wrote that people in London feared they were dead. He named no killer. He was writing while the events were still happening. Mancini's account sat undiscovered in a French library until 1934. By that point, almost everything people believed about the princes had been shaped by sources written decades later, most of them under Tudor rule, with every political reason to portray the previous king as a villain. So here's the question this whole story turns on. There are 3 suspects in this case. One is the obvious choice. The other 2 are the ones historians rarely discuss, and one of them had more to gain from this murder than anyone else alive. The obvious suspect is Richard III. He had the motive. The boys stood between him and the throne. He had the means. They were inside a building he controlled, and within weeks of their disappearance, he had declared himself king. The titulus regis, an act of parliament passed in June 1483, declared Edward IV's marriage invalid, making both boys illegitimate and clearing the path for Richard. What almost nobody knows about that document, after Richard III was defeated at Bosworth in 1885, Henry VII, the new king, ordered every copy of the titulus regis to be destroyed. Every single one. He wanted it burned from the record. One copy survived, found in a monastery in 1525, nearly 40 years after the order to destroy it. Why would a king order the destruction of a legal document? That is a question worth sitting with. The second suspect is Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. He was Richard III's closest ally in the seizure of power. He had access, And then, strangely, in the autumn of 1483, he turned against Richard and led a rebellion. It failed. Richard had him executed in November 1483. Whatever Buckingham knew, he took it with him. The third suspect is the man who actually benefited most in the long run, Henry Tudor, who became Henry VIII after defeating Richard at Bosworth in August 1485. Think about what Henry VIII inherited. If the princes were alive, they had better claims to the throne than he did. Henry's claim was thin. He descended through an illegitimate line on his mother's side, and his father's line carried no royal blood at all. The princes being dead was, for Henry, entirely convenient. And here's the detail that matters. Henry VII never declared the princes dead. He never charged Richard III with their murder. In attainder proceedings against Richard, where the goal was to strip him of everything, the murder of the princes is not listed among the charges. If you had proof your enemy had murdered 2 children and you were about to legally destroy his legacy, you would list that murder. Henry VII did not. Which brings us to 1674, a box of bones under a staircase, and the decision a king made that ensured this case would never be solved. If you're finding this useful, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. Now back to 1674. July 1674. Workmen were demolishing a staircase at the Tower of London, at the base of the White Tower. About 10 feet down, they found a wooden box. Inside the box were bones. The bones were assessed as belonging to 2 children. The approximate ages matched. Charles II had them transferred to Westminster Abbey, placed in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren and buried in the Henry VII Lady Chapel. No forensic investigation, no documentation of exactly which bones went where. Charles II moved quickly. The burial happened, and the matter was considered closed. The urn has been there since 1678. In 1933, the bones were examined briefly by 2 researchers, Lawrence Tanner, a historian, and a physician named William Wright. They concluded the remains belonged to 2 children, one approximately 12 to 13 years old, the other somewhat younger. They found what appeared to be blood staining on one of the jawbones. They also found something that received almost no public attention: animal bones. Mixed in with the children's remains were bones from fish, mammals, and birds, evidence that whatever was originally in that location had been disturbed and combined with other material over centuries. The 1933 examination used techniques that are now nearly a century out of date. No DNA analysis, no isotopic testing, no modern forensic methodology of any kind. That is where the evidence sits today. Scientists have techniques right now that could tell us not just whether these bones belong to the princes, but where those children grew up, what they ate, and potentially how they died. All they need is permission to test. So why hasn't that permission ever been given? The Richard III Society, one of the oldest historical societies in England, has been formally requesting permission to conduct DNA testing on the Westminster Abbey bones since the 1980s. That is more than 4 decades of requests. The Dean and Chapter of Westminster Abbey have consistently declined. Their stated position is that human remains should not be disturbed without compelling reason. They also cite Church of England policies against the examination of remains in its care. That reasoning sounds principled, but Westminster Abbey has permitted examination of other royal tombs. The body of Edward I was opened and examined in 1774. Henry V's tomb has been studied. There is no absolute prohibition. There are decisions made case by case. And for the princes, case after case, decade after decade, the answer has been no. Here's what a DNA test could actually determine. A bone sample from the Westminster bones tested against the mitochondrial DNA of a known living descendant of the prince's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, could confirm or deny that the bones belonged to her children. Richard III's own mitochondrial DNA was successfully extracted in 2014 from his Leicester bones. A living Plantagenet female line descendant has already been identified. The test is scientifically feasible. The obstacle is not technical. The obstacle is permission. Now, here's the question the refusal itself raises. Who does it serve to leave this unsolved? Historians disagree on why the refusal continues. Some believe it is institutional caution, that the Abbey genuinely applies its principle of non-disturbance consistently. Others point to political sensitivity. Any result from a DNA test would reopen centuries of dynastic legitimacy questions. If the bones are identified as the prince's, the question of who killed them becomes active again. If the bones are not the prince's, if they belong to someone else entirely, then the question of what happened to Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury is completely open once more. Either outcome has implications. England's current royal family descends from Henry VII, the man who had the most to gain from the prince's births and the least to gain from a resolved investigation. That is not an accusation, it is a fact about the political geometry of the situation. What we know is this. In 1483, 2 boys went into the Tower and never came out. In 1674, bones were found and buried without examination. In 1933, those bones were opened briefly and resealed. And every year since the 1980s, requests to examine them properly have been denied. The coffin is sealed. The king said that was the end of it. Except it wasn't, because the question is still here, and the bones are still there, and the science exists. Edward V would have been 12 years old at the time of his coronation. He never wore the crown. His brother, Richard, would have been 9. Neither boy ever left a documented account of what happened to them, because whatever happened to them happened before they could. The men who might have been responsible, Richard III, the Duke of Buckingham, Henry VII, are all buried in English churches. Their remains are largely undisturbed. No one has proposed testing their DNA for comparison to the Tower bones. The small marble urn in Westminster Abbey sits in one of the most visited buildings in the world. Millions of people walk past it every year. Most of them do not stop. 541 years and still no answer. Not because the answer is impossible, because someone keeps choosing not to find it. That is where this story ends, not with a resolution, with a refusal. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to let me know in the comments.